Okay, so I have the cylinder head off the Jeep, and I've already cleaned the surface of the cylinder head, and I'll go over that a little bit more in the procedure I used when we go to set the head on. But before I do the head, one of the things that's easily exposed while the head is off and while the exhaust and intake manifolds are off is the freeze plugs on the side of the head. So the freeze plugs, or expansion plugs, or core plugs as they're called, are round metal plugs, and these are driven into the side of the engine. Now the ones from the factory on this motor are steel, and since it's a 95, so they're 25 years old now. They've been in this engine for 25 years, and they're made out of steel, so there may be some corrosion, so it made sense that now is a good time to do them. So we're going to take out the steel ones, we're going to put in brand new brass ones before we install the cylinder head. While it's easy to do, these are pretty inexpensive. I think it cost me around 15 or 20 bucks for all 5 of them, if even that much. I don't think it was that much. So it just makes sense to do them. In order to change them, I'm going to need a couple tools. So first tool is an inertial accelerometer, commonly known as a hammer. And then I'm going to use a pry bar. And the pry bar is different than a screwdriver in that this is blunted, and also it has an angle here. So I'm going to use this to drive the freeze plug in. So on the old freeze plug, I'm actually going to go right along in the surface, right along right here. And I want to drive it in. And when I do that, it's going to flip. And once it flips, I can either use the pry bar to grab it against the block and pry it out, or I'll use a set of channel locks and grab the lip. The block is here, and I will be able to pry it out. We don't want to leave this inside the engine because it'll cause a restriction for the cooling and can actually cause some superheating next to the cylinder. So we definitely don't want to do that. When it comes time to install them, I'm going to need to do a couple things. I'm going to need to use some emery cloth, which is a fine sandpaper with a cloth backing, to clean out where the freeze plug sits, because I want to get any corrosion and everything out of it. And then I'm going to take a very, very thin layer of silicone and put it on the freeze plug so that when I install it, if there's any scratches or any imperfections in the cast iron, I'm not going to get any coolant leaking through it. So again, a very, very small layer of silicone. I'll show you that when I do it. And to install it, when we install it, we can use what's called a freeze plug installation tool. So this comes with several different discs and their size for the freeze plug. I've already looked this one up, and you can see it has a lot of different angles to it. I can lock it at different angles. I can leave it loose. I've had to notch it a couple times to get clearance for different installations. And there's also an adapter I can put on the end of this if I want to use an air chisel, if it's something that I couldn't get a hammer in and use it. But we'll be using our hammer and driving this in. I can also take this off and just use the end of this, which I have a few times, and beat on that with a copper-headed hammer and use it and install it directly. But this allows us, when we're on the vehicle, to go up and install a freeze plug in an area where I can't get a straight shot at. And by rotating this around, I can change where the force is on the freeze plug so I can make sure it seats. And you can see this sticks out further than the freeze plug, so when this hits the block all the way around, I know the freeze plug's properly installed. So let's get started by knocking out a freeze plug. There we go. So it just knocked out. Get my fingers in here and kind of pull it so I can get the lip. And I'm going to use my pry bar and popped it right out. And so here's the freeze plug, and you see the corrosion on it. Not too bad. But again, you don't know. It only takes a little pinhole for these to start leaking. So it's well worth the time to knock all 5 of these out and reinstall them. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this one up, and then you can see what the installation is, and then I'll do all the rest of them. So I'm going to take my emery cloth, make sure the surface is dry, and I've already drained the block, otherwise it would have gotten a lot of coolant out. So while I had the head up, I actually used a tool to suck all the coolant out so I didn't make a mess. And I'm going to go in and clean this up. I'm going to run my finger along in here and make sure that it feels okay to me. If I feel any grooves or notches, I want to sand that out a little bit more. I don't really want to remove a lot of material. I want to get rid of all the corrosion that's accumulated behind the freeze plug that I'm going to be driving in against. So I want to make sure the surface is flat all the way through. And that's also going to help with the installation of my freeze plug and help ensure that my new freeze plug doesn't leak. In order for the freeze plug not to leak, it needs to be perfectly square to the block, which is why we use the tool. So I'm going to take my new freeze plug and check it against my old one and make sure it's the same size around. Now we do notice that the new freeze plug is slightly thinner than the old one. That's not uncommon. They do make shallow and deep freeze plugs, and then they make freeze plugs that are almost perfectly flat, that just are slightly concave. And so here I have one that has a dish. It's enough, and if I look at the shiny surface where it actually sealed, it's about the same width as what I have here. So slightly different freeze plug design. The important thing I'm looking at is the diameter correct, and does it have enough surface to seal, and it does, so these are going to work just fine. Okay, so I'm going to use a little bit of ultra black silicone. So like I said, I don't need very much. And all I'm going to do is put a little bit of spread right on here. So if you notice, I'm really not putting a whole bunch on. It's really more of a light film, because all I'm trying to do is cover up any little grooves or imperfections that might be in the housing. So I got this set, put it on the tool and the hammer, and let's see how this goes in. Now you can see here it wanted to walk sideways on me, so I may end up having to go in and take with just the lid and tap it back straight. So if we're doing that, I'm going to grab a copper hammer, and this one is copper headed so it won't mar my surface. Get a little more height to it. And you can see on the little GoPro, when it finally went, it went in real nice. So the idea is not to get it too cocked. If it's cocked part way, stop. We got to start hitting on the high end of it. So I'm going to I have another one out, so I'll put that one in. The one I just did is probably going to be about the hardest, but given how it went in, I'm probably going to be putting all of them in just by using this part of the tool and this hammer. And part of that's leverage, part of that's angle. There's no wrong way to get these in. As far as when I'm using the tool, there's only a wrong way to seat them. So I've had before where I've had very little clearance, and I've had to use a big pry bar and actually use a pry bar to force the freeze plug in. So, and get it started and tap. I mean, so some of these are much harder than others to get seated, but that's why they pay a half hour a piece to take them out and put them back in. So, and that's on top of whatever I need to remove to get them out of the way. So even though I'm doing 5 freeze plugs here, they're giving me 2.5 hours to put these things in. That's a fair amount of time. So for me to spend some time cleaning stuff up, making sure they're seated properly, and of course I can discount that down since I'm doing a cylinder head or something like that, but keep in mind that's generally what the book gives you, is a half hour per freeze plug. And that's a straight shot. That doesn't include moving anything out of the way. So it's real important to keep that in mind when you're thinking, looking at it, go, oh, that's an easy job. I'll be done in 5 minutes. Well, guess what? It's not 5 minutes. And see, that went a little easier not using the extension. So again, each car is a little bit different, and that's why we have more than one kind of hammer, because I can use this. I'm not going to damage my tool, and I can still use the tool's design. I've had this tool for probably 35 years. It still works. So if you take care of stuff and you buy good stuff, it'll last your lifetime. So the important thing to making it last is using it in the right way. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these done, and I'll see you when I'm ready to put the cylinder head on.